Welcome to Relay Chain, a podcast produced by Parity Technologies where we discuss all things substrates, Polkadot, and Web3. Today we have Gavin Wood for the first episode of the Relay Chain. He's the co-founder of Ethereum and the co-founder of Parity and founder of Polkadot. Welcome.
Thanks.
So I want to start with the early Web3 philosophy. And I read this prior to Ethereum, you were working on music and legal software. But in a 2014 podcast, you said that Ethereum would just be a weekend project or over Christmas break. But you also had some blog posts that were outlining Web3, like from low-level messaging to front-end stuff. So how much had you thought about this? Was the Web3 vision something that came really quick, or was it a really long time in the making?
It was a while, I guess, before. I think it was, I first sort of rediscovered Bitcoin in like 2013. And it wasn't long after sort of understanding a bit better how it worked that I sort of came to the conclusion that for it to survive, it was going to need to decentralize not just the basic currency itself, but also things like the exchanges. So the infrastructure that was at the time, entirely centralized. And I sort of came up initially, I guess it was like May, June time, 2013, with a sort of design about how it would work, a sort of decentralized message passing with order matching system. It didn't really go anywhere. It was just sort of a thought experiment, which is just to sort of imagine how a decentralized application like an exchange application might work. But fast forward to like March, April 2014, and it became clear that like Ethereum was going to suffer from a similar sort of problem in that, you can decentralize the very core of the protocol you want, but if you don't have decentralized infrastructure surrounding it, then it's not going to fulfill the sort of overarching purpose. And I guess like Whisper as the communications sort of mechanism for that Web3 platform that I sort of envisioned back then was pretty similar to the order distribution architecture for the sort of decentralized exchange thing that I'd come up with a year before. The other sort of main component of Web3, sort of as I envisioned it back then, was the swarm component of this idea of a decentralized publication mechanism. And really that was based almost entirely upon like BitTorrent plus Kademlia as a means of basically once you have a hash, you'd be able to find the pre-image to that hash. Someone would have it somewhere, and it was really just a protocol to locate it and download it. The idea behind sort of Swarm Whisper obviously grew beyond these two basic origin points. With Swarm eventually sort of, I imagined it to be much more sort of cryptographic, with the idea being that no one would, by looking at your traffic, know precisely what you were trying to download. And the same with Whisper. No one would know, looking at your traffic, what it was that who you were communicating with and when you were communicating. And for these to really be delivered, I think we're going to have to start looking at more additional technologies like mixnets and so on that might be able to help.
Yeah, so we don't hear too much about Swarm and Whisper right now. Do you think the underlying goal stays the same? Have they been replaced by other technologies?
Well, Swarm and Whisper were never really specific technologies. They were rather kind of placeholders in this platform. Web3 is sort of a meta platform. It's like a set of technologies which taken together can help people create decentralized applications and distribute them and so on. But it was never really meant to be a singular platform that moves along with particular versions. In principle, Bitcoin and BitTorrent could form part of a sort of notional Web3. It's not to say that these are not components, that the sort of pieces of the puzzle. It's just that as time goes on, I expect that we will get the technology will develop and we'll get increasingly closer to being able to deliver this, idea of a decentralized application platform that's massively multi-user.
Yeah, so you started out by talking about like a lot of the interactions between a technology like Bitcoin and the outside society is kind of via exchanges. How do you see this interaction growing, like from just an exchange into a business into maybe like a nation state or like more social governance?
I guess it's kind of interesting in that I don't see these decentralized applications really being obviously more comparable to a business or a nation state or a protocol than any of the other possibilities. Like, I don't think I wouldn't say like Bitcoin is more a nation state than a protocol, but I wouldn't even really say it's more of a protocol than a nation state. I wouldn't say either it's any more of either of those two than a business. It's none of the three, and it's all of the three. It's kind of it's a new kind of type of thing that we don't really have a word for. Well, I mean, we've got some terms like DAO and DAC and all the rest of it, but we don't really have a full understanding of what it is because we haven't really seen it sort of fulfill its potential quite yet. But in general, it's definitely going to have components of all of these three things. And so is any kind of decentralized application that's massively multi-user. So basically, everything that we can imagine being on Web3 will fulfill some of the characteristics that these three things have. But I don't really see them as being closer to one or more of the against the others. I mean, obviously, some things, particular use cases will lend themselves more to replace, for example, a business than they will to replace a nation state. But if we're talking sort of general about the technology, then no, I think it's really a new thing, and it's kind of different to all three.
Yeah, I didn't mean so much a comparison to like where it falls in line, but like what are the tools to integrate it with these other constructs that we already have in the real world? And maybe like a better way of framing it is just say like, you've written that like Web3 technologies give you some verifiable guarantees, like that the person who sent you the message is the message. I guess from a ground up approach, like what are these guarantees? And then like, how come these small set of guarantees can actually provide the foundation for something much larger? And why are like these the sets that are the most important?
Well, that's three questions. I'll try my best to do the first one. So the guarantees are pretty, I mean, you've got the document probably there. You can probably spell it out better than I can. But the guarantees are really about the sorts of things that we take for granted. We kind of, they're kind of implicit expectations that users typically have, that we as people typically have when we interact with, these massively multi-user systems, basically websites, web applications. But they often go unfulfilled. And the reason they often go unfulfilled is because, the systems by which we are interacting are kind of just little more than facades to companies or people that we don't really kind of have we would like to think that we trust them. And it may well be that we do trust them, but we don't have any real reason to trust them. Now, national laws and international law, as far as it goes, do try to help create some sort of trust. But in reality, the rationale for that there's nothing there. It doesn't really exist. The only reason that we trust that, Facebook isn't going to lose our data from another security fault is because, well, they haven't maybe lost our data so far, although of course they have, so we don't really trust them anymore. But we tend to give people, we tend to give these things the benefit of the doubt, and that's unfortunate because a lot of the time they really don't deserve it. And there is nothing more than this kind of blind benefit of the doubt level trust that they have going for them. The technology does almost nothing to protect our interests. And so really what Web3 is saying, right, well, the technology, let's actually build this from the ground up so that our interests are fundamentally protected. We get given these guarantees just by virtue of using certain pieces of technology. So yeah, knowing that you are, that who you're communicating with is in the open, we should assume that. We should assume that anybody who has access to an internet connection can know who that we are talking to, unless we take action against it. And if we take action against it, then we should have the guarantee that they will not know who they are talking to with some substantial degree of certainty. Similarly to what we're saying, should be possible to know that if we're talking to our friend over the internet, then random eavesdroppers are unable to determine what it is that we are saying to our friend, because we expect these kinds of one-to-one conversations. And it may just be talking, it may be sending pictures, it may be doing video, whatever. We expect it to have some degree of privacy, like probably quite a high degree of privacy at times. Well, those expectations should be met in guarantees from the technology, not from companies like Facebook or like Google that want to tell us, oh yes, don't worry, we've got your interests covered. We'll take all the precautions and make sure that it's not hacked by by various nefarious actors. No. It should be protected by the technology itself. And as such, it should be open and transparent and auditable, so that we don't have to trust any individual actor, be it a technology provider or a company or a government, that our interests are being looked after. Rather, we can trust people that we already know and understand and are comfortable with to actually go ahead and audit them. We can place in the hands of impartial actors or people that we already have come to rely on to make sure that they also believe that this technology is correct. So to take a very simple example, it may be that my mother doesn't understand that this technology can protect her interests particularly well, but she can ask me and I have a much higher degree of understanding, and yet she also trusts me because, I tend to tell her the truth about things. Now, that's not the case if the technology is closed and opaque behind a company's profit wall. In that case, all we can do is trust the company. And similarly, in certain instances, it's difficult to trust governments, and there are various sort of criminal actors and elements online that make it very difficult to trust anyone that you would generally sort of meet cold call style online.
Yeah, so certainly like the outcome sounds great, but a lot of people who have power, whether it's states or corporations, are not going to see that gracefully. And so like we've already seen like a lot of banks or Facebook kind of adopting these watered down blockchains. Like which aspects of the system do you view as being like critical that you can't really make any kind of compromise on in order to get these systems in place?
Well, the vision is the vision. And I wouldn't really, I would set that as the desired end goal. Although, these things generally have, like, in reality, there is a sort of degree of compromise that is simply because, these sorts of ideals and principles are rarely actually pragmatic and practical. But nonetheless, it's something that I think we should all have in mind as being the ideal end goal of all of this. And I think seeing how the world's sort of realigning itself in the last 20 years, I think we can, I'm not particularly worried that the world will eventually sort of realign and accept this kind of trust-free technology over time. And yeah, sure enough, the large actors in the world at the moment, the establishment that sort of get by because we trust them, or because we cannot help but trust them, we cannot help but use them, regardless of whether we trust them or not, in fact. These guys are not super happy about the idea of being sort of disintermediated and eventually having their relevance reduced substantially, because actually we don't need these big behemoths to tell us who and who we can't communicate with, what we can and cannot say, and etc. Rather, we will have technology that allows us to be sure that our personal interests are being looked after. So I'm not like particularly bothered about working out how much of this technology banks can use in order to increase their profit margins. I actually don't think it matters. I think what matters is ensuring that the technology is developed and delivered in order to make the current requirement to trust these kinds of actors, the banks and the insurance corporations and the governments and the Googles and the Facebooks, to make the requirement to trust them unneeded.
So in order to make it pragmatic for people to adopt this technology, there has to be a more user-friendly experience. And I see one of the hurdles in the user experience of blockchain or crypto technology right now is that you have a lot of responsibility. Like you have to keep your private key safe. And do you see that Web 2 as an inherent advantage in UX? Or do you think, like, how do you see UX evolving, and what are the big hurdles to developing a better experience?
It's early days. What we're looking at is something that, if we're a software people, would say is pre-alpha. This is little more than a tech preview. So yeah, at the moment it's like, oh, you have to keep track of your key, and you have to, do all sorts of things. You're exposed to language like signatures and transactions. Yeah, it's not user friendly. It's not usable, accessible. But that's because we're still very much in the early stages of being developed. We're like the internet in '92 or whatever. It's this stuff isn't designed to be used by normal people for normal things. It's important to build the fundamentals before you start relying upon them for important stuff. But nonetheless, you can start to see some initial sprouts flowering of usability and accessibility, even in sort of Web3 terms. And over time, we'll transition more, from traditional centralized models to sort of new decentralized models. And over time, as they become more popular, they'll become more accessible and usable, and people will develop an increasing amount of effort to ensuring that, for example, if you lose your secret key in one place, there will be simple and effective means of regaining access to your various things. And there are ways and means of doing it. It's not that the ideas don't exist. It's simply that the solutions haven't been developed, they haven't been engineered, they haven't been tested, they haven't been rolled out, delivered, and adopted. But over time, that will happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. We're at like 92 phase in the internet in this. But you don't see anything that's like inherent in the Web3 backend that prevents you from having like a good experience or a comparable experience on the front end, or possibly even better.
I would expect it to be even better. Of course, there are certain types of things inevitably that will be favored, that will favor either a more centralized or a more decentralized architecture. But I think in general, it will be at worst no different, and at best an awful lot better than what we have at the moment.
Yeah, I want to transition a little bit towards governance. You and a few other people have talked about the internet as kind of like a new jurisdiction. How does this mesh with like the geographic concept of legality and like what gets preserved and replaced?
So legality is a concept largely deriving from like the idea of nation states and sovereignty. So a nation state is sovereign, or has sovereign laws, and that it can enforce and punish according, as it feels best. And in some very digital sense, blockchain is similarly sovereign. It has a bunch of laws or rules that it can enforce and punish as it sees fit. So we have two different kind of sovereignties here. I mean, they're both very much all about, enforcing rules, but the notion of the digital world being and the sort of well-connected, fully globalized, completely integrated digital world being enforced with national level, which is a purely sort of geographical boundary, national level rules doesn't make any sense. And we're already seeing how little sense it makes by the fact that, we have VPN providers that trivially allow you to, if you don't like this particular website knowing that you're from the UK, then fire up a VPN and they'll instead know that you're from Latvia. Suddenly, national barriers don't mean anything on the internet. And you go to China and they mean a little bit. It's a bit more of a pain to run a VPN in China, but it's still possible. You arrive at the airport, you can fire up your phone, fire up a decent enough VPN, and sure enough, the Great Firewall of China is not so great. I don't see that changing. If anything, I see it sort of continuing in the same vein. I don't think that national barriers are going to become a huge problem. Now, there's a small chance that, the UN or something forms some like internet standardization firewall thing that means that no matter where in the world that you go, you still won't be able to sort of, access certain things or whatever, use the internet in a certain way. I think the chances of that are very, very limited, very small, primarily because it's technologically very difficult. Even in China, it's still possible, even without VPN, to sort of find your way through, sort of ports and, the dark web or whatever, outside of the material that maybe China would prefer you look at. So I think I think technologically it's not possible. I think also just simply by the fact that national governments tend to be in one level or another of competition. means that they will find it almost impossible to agree on any kind of global firewall. And as such, I think that we will end up with a world where the internet is its own jurisdiction, or rather set of jurisdictions, and blockchains will become like sort of their own sovereign nations within this world.
I guess what implications does that have? Like if you're involved in the governance of a blockchain, but you live in a particular country, how do these things collide, or hopefully not collide?
An interesting question. We don't really know because blockchain governance is so novel. There isn't really much to go off at this point. If you are physically located in a country, then whatever it is that you do, they will consider their business. If they know for a fact, subject to their own sort of laws, if they can demonstrate in some sort of court of law that you are behind such and such an internet identity, then yes, they may well hold you to account for whatever it is that you do as part of governance. And depending on that particular country's, freedom of speech and whatever rights that they sort of give you, it may be an issue that you are taking part in governance. But I'd say that's a fairly big if. And I'd say it largely, it's more for maybe actors that have, very critical roles in governance. But for sort of decentralized governance, where we have, a multitude of much smaller actors, and we see the emergent effect of them coming together, I find it hard to imagine any particular nation state going after these relatively small fish. I see it, in fact, as kind of similar to let's say, the governance of Bitcoin. Yeah, where not that there really is any governance, but if we want to get like kind of relatively low level governance, then we can imagine it's sort of Bitcoin nodes and miners and transactors signaling their intents. And is there ever a sort of a nation state that has said, right, you're running a Bitcoin node or you're mining, therefore you're contributing to the sort of DAO that is Bitcoin, and therefore you are helping run this sort of alternative currency, which maybe the country has decided is wrong or is illegal, is breaking some sort of money transmission laws. No, we don't sort of see that. It's assumed that if enough people are sort of doing it, then it's basically going to be fine, and the government will just have to get on and do something else.
Yeah, so when it comes to governance on chain, a lot of protocols integrate some form of coin voting. Polkadot introduced a council, kind of centered around minority rights, and then the fact that money controls modern democracy notwithstanding, like one of the goals of liberal democracy is protecting minority rights. Can you expand on the difference between, coin holder voting as a narrow topic and on-chain governance as a bigger picture?
Sure. So coin holder voting is basically this idea that if a decision needs to be made within some system that has coins, then each of the owners or controllers of those coins will have some voice in this decision. And the amount of voice that they have will be generally proportional to the amount of coins that they have. So one coin equals sort of one vote, so to speak. And normally there's a, majority carries assumption. And there may be some additional quorum requirements as well, but it's a very simple mechanism. Now, on-chain governance in general is forget that particular mechanism, and it's the idea that on some consensus blockchain usually there is a decision to be made, and on-chain governance, in my mind at least, also implies that when the decision is made, it's enacted, right? It's enforced. But regardless of that, we assume that there's some decision to be made, and there is some mechanism on the chain that the chain itself enforces, some process that the chain itself enforces, which determines what the outcome of that decision should be, what should be decided. Now, how it determines it, we leave undefined, right? That's the magic of on-chain governance. Different chains may have different types of governance. Some chains may do this stupid sort of coin voting thing. Fine, whatever. It's pretty dumb, but it's the first thing, so whatever, you got to start somewhere. But other chains we would hope, like Polkadot, introduce other more sophisticated, more nuanced mechanisms. And eventually I'd hope that on-chain governance sort of proceeds and we end up with some kind of working futarchy kind of model where the mass, the crowd as a whole, feeds in information under sort of some set of economic interests that mean that the chain will ultimately be able to make whatever the correct decision is based upon some, fundamental assumptions. So, whereas Polkadot's is certainly not the futarchy level, we do, there is some sophistication behind it. We do introduce concepts like lock voting, which means that, as coin, it's not a simple coin holder vote, rather there's some degree of conviction. If you are happy to lock yourself into the system and the potential ramifications of your decisions for longer, then it means that your opinion counts more. And it's not to say that this is, I don't think that this is certainly the be all and end all, but I think it is an important step towards this ultimate desire that blockchains should be able to govern themselves, so to speak. And I don't mean that, again, blockchain sort of the computer rules, but rather it shouldn't be the case that individuals rule, as is the case, in sort of traditional governments where you elect a president or a prime minister and you have a cabinet and they basically make decisions over certain things. It's people who make decisions, but rather that a blockchain makes the decisions based upon combining all sorts of, inputs and factors. And some of those will be the opinions of coin holders, but there may be others as well, in such a way that no single actor or no small set of actors can influence the vote in some nefarious way.
But also the ability to change the factors and inputs and rules by which it updates itself.
Sure, that will be one of the decisions that it might need to make.
So when it comes to like the idea of a council, what is really like the social contract of the council with the stakeholders, and who are the stakeholders?
So the council's a fairly simple abstraction. It's based upon the Parliament in the UK. It's a set of elected representatives. In this case, I chose to use an approval voting system that's rotating, which means there isn't a single election event. Rather, there's a number of them, and over time, the members sort of rotate out. So they get refreshed, but in a sort of round robin fashion, so that none of them, not all of them, have to sort of go out at the same time, as is the case in the US and the UK systems. Once they're in place, then they're free to kind of, as a whole, form much of the legislative timetable for the governance system. There can still be public votes, but they happen sort of in an interspersed fashion, interspersed with the votes that the council puts forward. And the council can, if they are unanimous, can sort of bias the public, bias the count to a degree that means the public have to, or the coin holders, or rather not just the coin holders, but the lock voting coin holders, have to vote against it, with some substantial quorum before it would be rejected. So basically, the council, if they act as a whole, as a unanimous body, get the benefit of the doubt that whatever it is that they're tabling is in the interests of the blockchain. But it cannot be emphasized more that the ultimate source of authority for making these decisions rests with the coin holders. So it still means that if 50% of the coin holders with full conviction believe that, the decision shouldn't happen, then they will always be able to ensure that decision doesn't happen. They are the ultimate authority. The council are merely sort of caretakers that have the benefit of the default, but little else.
So this idea that like over 51% can just fork the network and take it where they want, like who are the stakeholders and are they all part of the network? And so like a parallel I'm kind of thinking of is that like with the recent Boeing 737 MAX crashes, like the people who are in the airplane presumably are not part of the design process of the airplane. They have no say in this. And so with the internet affecting so many people in the world, how do you go about looking after the rights of people or at least being mindful of the people who may not have a direct stake in the system, but are affected by it in some way?
If you want to have a voice, then you need to get some stake. I absolutely refute the view that blockchains are some sort of public service, that every person on the planet has some right or some say in the decisions that should be made within the blockchain. Absolutely not, no. The blockchain is an economic vehicle. If you don't want to take part in the economic vehicle, you're free to. You're free to not take any stake in it, and you are free to ignore it. But ultimately, the economic vehicle owes you nothing.
So this is essentially a voluntary democracy.
It's not a democracy at all, nor should it be. Democracy is all about one head, one vote. Democracy is about all of the people within the nation having a say. Well, I'm happy for the idea of all of the people within that hold stake in the system having a say. Sure, weighted by the stake that they hold, but everyone who is not holding stake, they don't get to have a say.
But holding stake is voluntary, so you get to choose if you think you're affected by the system, then you can buy into it and have a voice.
So I'm affected by the US. I don't have a voice in their elections, but that doesn't stop the US from being democratic.
Fair enough. Whether that's right or wrong is kind of besides the point, I guess.
Yeah.
When it comes to interfacing with the outside world, one of the goals of Ethereum smart contracts was to take ambiguous outside world data and be able to make a very clear decision on this. Like, what's the best way to define a program, like how it should behave, and then what to do when it doesn't behave as it is intended, besides like the code is law approach, which doesn't really work because, as a reference implementation in code, it doesn't always behave how you think it was going to.
Sorry, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, so not just an Ethereum smart contract, but any kind of deterministic system that's difficult to mutate, you could say. If it doesn't behave the way you intend it to, what's the best way to handle the fallout when it doesn't behave that way?
I think principles are important. And the principle of the matter is that when you sign up to a system, you sign up to its rules, even if they're based upon a misunderstanding of the rules you signed up to. The misunderstanding is sort of, in principle, is you as the user's fault, not the system's fault, not the other users of the system's fault. I think principles are important in providing a guiding light, of the rough direction to go in, where we should be headed. And I think as a principle, particularly for low-level systems, immutability is perfectly reasonable. That is not to say that there are instances where principles need to be set aside in the interests of self-interest and pragmatism. And when I say self-interest, I mean the interest of the system as a whole, not the interest of any particular individual actors. Governance is there as a means to determine and codify formally when pragmatism and the interests of the wider interests of the system outweigh the principle of immutability, outweigh the principle of expectation. In general, the systems exist to uphold user expectations. If the governance mechanism should decide whether expectations are better upheld if the system remains immutable against maybe some unexpected state transition because of some bug in a contract, for example, or whether they are best upheld, whether the expectations were such that a sufficiently large number of people in the system believed that the system would act in some way that wasn't actually the way that the code says it should act. That's the point of governance. It's basically to work out this really soft notion of how many people expected it to do X versus how many people expected it to do Y, and the strength of those expectations. And to balance it against the benefit of immutability, but then the costs of immutability too. That's not something that a protocol can sort of objectively build in. We just don't know how to quantify human expectation. And that's why we have to sort of fall back on humans and their governance mechanisms. But overall, it's really one against principle versus pragmatism. And you need something like governance to work out where the balance lies.
So going to like a more technical level, we talk a lot about supply chains and sensors, oracles. So if you have like sensors or actuators that are interacting with the system. A lot of these systems have floating point numbers, for example, that you are outspoken against, or calibration errors or drift. It's pretty easy to tell when, like, if a sensor just fell off, but there are other errors that are kind of fuzzier. So how can you take like these trustless, deterministic systems and interface them with the real world so that they're not just self-contained?
Well, interfacing with the real world is like input and output. So the output is relatively easy. You just say the blockchain wants this to happen. I will pay someone if they make it happen. Input's the harder thing, sure. So you have some phenomena in the real world that you want to record on chain. Now, your chain doesn't want to trust any particular oracles, or any particular measuring device or measuring actor. And so we end up with something of a problem. We want to sort of measure something, or we want to get a measurement of something, but the blockchain itself doesn't have any power to measure it itself, and it can't trust anyone to do it, any one actor to do it for it. So what do? Well, you have to sort of spread it out and say, right, well, we're going to use some cryptographic mechanisms to sort of select, perhaps at random, a bunch of bonded measuring people that are going to go and measure something on demand and then come back and tell us what it was and then be paid, presuming, on the assumption that the blockchain sort of continues to believe they give a good answer. Now, you've got all sorts of cryptoeconomic or economic mechanisms that that can help in some way. Shelling points being a sort of notable one. Unfortunately, there are pretty much just as many arguments why these things may not work when the stakes are very high. I don't really have a sort of, I'm not going to come and give an amazing answer and cover a silver bullet here. No, I don't think it really exists. I think you just have to accept that there are mechanisms that exist and make sure that you have the right mechanism given the right sort of level of potential malicious actor or attack within the system.
Well, that's hopefully one of the benefits of increased interoperability, is that you can have increased specialization in dealing with these niche cases.
Yeah, I think that's right. The ability to create sophisticated on-chain logic will no doubt be an important factor building the sorts of things that are robust to attack.
I want to finish up with, just for new people who would like to get into the area, what do you think are the most important skills to have, and what areas are lacking in the industry that could use a lot more development?
Deep thought is a really important skill. Now, I'm not sure if it's a skill or a talent, but the ability to consume and internalize a problem and understand it to the point that you can think about it outside of a traditional sort of trustworthy central actor with sort of untrustworthy secondary actors asking about stuff for it, to the point that you can really imagine it as many disinterested actors all trying to interact with each other, asking them questions, and think about the sorts of rules that you can introduce that would allow the emergent effects to become what it is that you want. That's an incredibly difficult thing to learn, but it's something that is very important in the world of sort of, this trust-free digital crypto-economic world. Beyond that, like understanding, very basic computer science things like computational complexity and storage complexity, very important. Understanding what parts of an algorithm may need to be refactored or redesigned simply because they can't be implemented on-chain, because it would blow up the state too much, or it would have potentially an attack vector in terms of economics. Beyond the sort of more computational stuff, I think understanding better which problems are better solved in a decentralized fashion, and which problems are perfectly fine for now solved in a centralized fashion is important. And for that, it's like really about understanding a little more about, the underlying technology and the costs and the benefits to using things like, trust-free systems like blockchains and decentralized messaging. So yeah, it's not really skills, I guess, but for sure, any skills are useful, right? Any skills can be turned to be used in this ecosystem. But if you're looking for sort of those really important bits of genius or talent that really push you into the next level, then I think that's what they would be.
This is sort of like a meta complexity where you have complex systems with a lot of parts interacting with each other. And then to understand how can you have a bunch of independent actors, whether they're people or computers, acting within various parts or multiple parts of the system, and then how that all interacts.
Yeah, it's really just, it's almost like designing board games, actually. So I did this as well before I came to work in this world, this ecosystem. And designing board games is all about coming up with a set of rules, which at once makes it sufficiently good of a challenge, but also that people can understand sufficiently well to be able to come up with a strategy. And that's really difficult. Creating rules that are accessible, that people can understand and internalize enough to like work out how to play the game.
Thanks for coming on, Gav.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of the Relay Chain podcast. Our upcoming guests include Amber Balday and Patrick Nielsen from Clover, Anna Kaplan and Deirdre Connolly from the Zcash Foundation, and Jillian York from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We'd love to keep in touch. Follow us on Twitter at RelayChain or email podcast@parity.io. Our team at Parity includes some of the leading peer-to-peer networking developers, consensus algorithm inventors, blockchain innovators, and Rust developers. If you want to learn more about our work or want to work with us, visit our website at parity.io and sign up for our newsletter at parity.io/newsletter.